Welcome, everybody, back to our first panel of our afternoon session for Mapping Higher Education's Future. This is the National Interest Panel, and I am delighted to have President Peter Wood of the National Association of Scholars, Gail, Heriot, who is both professor of law at the University of San Diego School of Law and, since 2007, a member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, and Rachelle Peterson, NAS Senior Research Fellow. Each of them will be speaking for about 20 minutes, or a little shorter if they so desire, on, ACA 5, the 1619 Project, and Confucius Institutes, at the end of which I will be moderating, getting myself on to communicate a few more questions. And I believe the order we have is Peter Wood first, then Gail Heriot, then Rachelle Peterson. So
is that a go ahead?
Sorry, Peter? Yes, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, yes.
Okay. Hi. Well, on August 18th of 2019, the New York Times published a special edition of its Sunday magazine supplement. It was titled The 1619 Project. It consisted of 100 pages of articles, photographs, poems, polemics. 10 of those articles were of substantial length, and 2 of those soon emerged as the principal items of interest. One was by Nicole Hannah-Jones, a writer for the New York Times, the other by Matthew Desmond, professor at Princeton. The announced purpose of the 1619 Project was to, quote, reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year. So why 1619? Because in August of that year, a pirate ship, the White Lion, docked near Jamestown, Virginia. The pirates had raided a Spanish slave ship headed for Mexico and captured its human cargo, many of whom soon died. Now they were short of provisions. They had survived a severe storm at sea, and their ship was in bad shape. They wanted to trade the slaves they had captured for food. Some residents of Jamestown agreed to the barter, and at that moment, the first known African slaves entered a British North American colony. All the rest, says the Times, editor Jake Silverstein and the 1619 Project creator Hannah-Jones followed from this barter. America became, in their words, a slaveocracy, which with minor variations it continues to be to this very day. Now this story has some holes in it. English law governing Virginia at the time made no provision for slaves, and it appears the idea of slave owning didn't much appeal to the settlers. But indentured servants were a familiar concept, and as best we can tell, the 20-something African captives were granted the status of indentured servants. Within a few years, they were free, and some of them prospered and became significant landowners. They intermarried with whites. One even brought a successful lawsuit against a white neighbor. This has been the subject of intensive historical investigation over many years. The facts I'm relaying are not strange new things. They were easily available to Hannah-Jones and the New York Times fact checkers had they troubled themselves to look. As the founding event of a slaveocracy, the arrival of the White Lion at Jamestown in 1619 is pretty lame. It would be more than half a century before chattel slavery got started in Virginia, and a lot longer than that before it became a major economic system. The story told by Hannah-Jones has other flaws. In fact, on close inspection, the number of flaws considerably outnumbers the number of facts. Slavery had existed in North America long before Jamestown. It was an established institution among many North American Indian tribes. African slaves had been introduced by the Spanish in Florida and Georgia almost a century earlier. And the most important fact here is that African slaves in the New World were mainly brought to the Caribbean and Latin America. More than 12.5 million estimated Africans were transported to the New World during the entire history of slavery. Of these, only 338,000 were brought to North America. That's 2.7%. Thus, the attempt to make America and America alone the original slave-based society is historically baseless. Slavery eventually became a pivotal institution in the intensive cotton production-based economies of the American South. But that was after Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin in 1794. That gin made cotton a far more profitable crop. The demand for cotton roughly doubled each decade following Whitney's invention. And this rise in demand fueled the South's appetite for slave labor to work the ever-expanding plantations. Now, this is history that should be known and studied in school and college curricula. The facts are important. The 1619 Project, however, is not satisfied with the facts. It juices them with outrageous misrepresentations. I'll mention what have emerged as the three most outrageous of those. The first is Hannah Jones's claim that the British colonies that joined to form the American Revolution were motivated by their desire to forestall an impending British emancipation of American slaves, of ending the institution of slavery in North America. In fact, the British had no such intention of abolishing slavery in the colonies, nor were the colonists under any mistaken impression that this was in the offing. On the contrary, some of the colonies had already seen the rise of strong abolitionist movements. Sustaining slavery simply was no part of the reason for the American Revolution, and hundreds, if not thousands, of American histories based on original documents of the period and continuing right up to the present have rather in-depth documented the motivations of the rebels, which never, ever concluded trying to sustain the institution of slavery against the threat of British abolition. The second of these outrageous claims is the idea that President Lincoln's motives in the Civil War were those of a racist whose real goal was to rid the United States of its Black population by shipping blacks overseas. In fact, Lincoln, along with most of the abolitionist movement prior to the Civil War, had long supported the option of giving emancipated slaves the choice of settling in a new overseas colony. This was, in fact, supported by many free blacks and by black leaders when President Lincoln met with them in a White House meeting that Hannah Jones speaks to. But Lincoln weighed this idea as the low point in his administration, and it came when the war was going poorly. He soon abandoned it altogether. And Lincoln, of course, became the supporter of what eventually would be the emancipation of all the slaves held in the South. The third outrageous claim comes from that other essay by Matthew Desmond, the Princeton professor, whose argument is that American capitalism was created by the slave-based Southern plantation system, and that we owe the terrible nature of capitalism today to its having been modeled on the oppression and exploitation of black slaves. This is a rather bizarre claim. Plantation slavery in the antebellum South bears a far greater resemblance to feudalism than it does to capitalism. It is true that plantations in this period were immensely profitable, but so were pirate ships in their day. Were they capitalist? No. Desmond tries to derive double entry bookkeeping, for example, from plantation accounting practices, despite its having been invented and widely practiced for centuries before the rise of those plantations. The claim is that because plantations made a lot of money and could mortgage slaves to raise more capital, the plantation economy taught Americans what Desmond calls low road capitalism, that is, exploiting workers to the maximum possible. He conjures what he calls the driving system, which is when a slave had met his quota for cotton picking or whatever, his quota would thereby increase, and he would be punished terribly with corporal punishment ad infinitum as his quota was infinitely expanding. Economist Phil Magnus has written a whole book dismantling this tangle of misconceptions that Desmond lays out. America did embark on a capitalist system fairly early on in its history, but that was in the free labor North, not in the slave economy South. Well, that's to give you a taste of what the 1619 Project is. Our task today of mapping higher education's future after the election comes into this in a few ways. First, the Times presented this project not simply as a Sunday entertainment, but as a curriculum, a model curriculum for first K-12 schools. The Pulitzer Center, as distinguished from the Pulitzer Foundation, occupied the last page of the New York Times Magazine, announcing that this thing was going to be adopted as a curriculum in the nation's schools, and that center was going to play a key part in that. It has kept its word. Thousands of school districts have now adopted the 1619 curriculum as a module, as something to be taught to our students. They're being taught something that is flatly false, and they're being taught with the oomph of the New York Times behind it. The Times has spent millions of dollars to promote this program. Anna Jones has crisscrossed the country giving speeches in its favor. She herself was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for opinion journalism on the basis of her work on this. We are in the midst of seeing this curriculum become something that will be used to indoctrinate school children coast to coast. That is something that has been, however, opposed by President Trump, most recently in a speech he gave at the National Archives in September. So it's entered into our curriculum already. It has entered into our presidential politics already. I'm not sure what President Biden, if there is one, will do about this, but he has, unlike President Trump, shown no aversion at all to what the 1619 Project teaches. There is a second way in which this enters into our discussion, which is that the historical, I should say, the establishment of American history professors overall has been very loath to get involved in this fight. A handful, that is to say, maybe 20 or 30 prominent American historians have spoken out. They organized themselves in a series of waves of protest letters to the New York Times, pointing out these errors, disputing the idea that the American Revolution was fought to perpetuate slavery, disputing the idea that Lincoln was a racist who meant to get rid of slaves by sending them elsewhere. Those claims the New York Times simply batted away. In most cases, they ignored them. It wasn't until in, I believe it was May of 2020, that one of the fact checkers for the New York Times came forward and said that she had warned the Times that its claims here were false, but the Times had not seen fit to correct them. The particular in that case was the one about the American Revolution. The result of it was that the Times added 2 words to its account. It said that some of the Americans had fought in the Revolution to perpetuate slavery. Well, that could be true if you could find one American of that period who was declared motivation was to protect slavery, but the Times has been unable to identify even that one American. We are left with this preposterous claim that the Times has foisted on the American curriculum, and we have been met with the deafening silence of the vast majority of American historians who know the truth, but are unwilling to get in the way of what they see as a wholesome attempt to rewrite into American history a more prominent role for African Americans. Well, I have no problem with a more prominent role for African Americans in the writing of American history, so long as that role is presented in a factual way. A truth will speak a lot louder than this tissue of falsehoods that's been put before us. As to how this plays out in the election, well, yesterday I was reading interviews with African American leaders in Detroit, for example, who were saying that Biden owes us, and there's some expectations we have of what that payback will be. I have no doubt that part of the payback is going to be the elevation of this new Afrocentric mythology to an even more prominent place in how history is taught in the United States. This goes to the question of who are we? What kind of nation is this? Is it a nation that is based on exploitation? Is it a nation based on freedom? The erasure of the American founding via the 1619 Project, the claim that it all begins with the arrival of the White Lion in 1619, never mind 1776, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, never mind 1620 when the Mayflower Compact was signed and set in motion a form of self-government in New England. Never mind the Civil War, which was a horrible bloodletting brought about to end the institution of slavery. All those things are pushed out of the picture. The 1619 Project declares that all of the advances in the rights of African Americans over the course of the last 400 years have come by dint of their own effort, thus erasing at one stroke the entire abolitionist movement and the involvement of whites at every step of the way in bringing an end to this horrible institution. The involvement of whites in the creation of the NAACP, the involvement of whites in the civil rights movement is negated as something of no consequence whatsoever, or yet another mask of oppression. If we are going to have a president who endorses those claims, we are in for a period of a kind of endarkenment of our American history. Endarkenment not in the sense of racialization, but in the sense of ignorance. This is bringing into a picture of who Americans are the fundamental falsehood that our nation is based on oppression, not on the pursuit of liberty and freedom. And with that, I will turn it back to the moderator.
Let's see, the moderator thought that it was actually Gail next, but I see her screen is Gail. I think it's Gail next. Gail, if you'd be so kind.
I popped out for a minute there. I don't know what happened, but let's hope this will work here. I bring greetings from the Golden State, where we have good news, I think. Astonishingly good news from the standpoint of those who thought that California's long march into identity politics could never be turned back. It looks like we've had a victory here. Prop 16 has been defeated, and not by a little bit. At last count, 56.8% of California voters have voted no on Prop 16. But let me back up a little bit and put this issue into perspective. Everybody knows, I'm sure, that California is a deep blue state. When I tell people that I live in California, I can always tell the conservatives and libertarians because they'll respond, you know, you got to get out of there, girl. And it's true that California's leaders, both in politics and in education, tend to be the sort that leans fairly heavily to the left. In the California legislature, for example, it's not just that Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1, although they do a little better than that, actually. But those who are Democrats and identify as Democrats usually would not, you know, many of them would not object to being characterized as supporters of identity politics. So that's where we are with our legislature. Let me just give you a couple of examples. This past year, the California legislature passed a statute that establishes quotas on the basis of race and on sexual orientation status for corporate boards of directors. They have also established a study commission to study the possibility of slave reparations. Let me point out, California was never a slave state, and yet our legislature is campaigning in favor of slave reparations. But most important, and of course what I want to talk about right now, is what was originally called ACA 5, and that is an Assembly Constitutional Amendment, number 5. The legislature passed that bill that would remove the following words from the California Constitution, and I'm quoting here: "The state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting." Those are the words that the California legislature wants to remove from the Constitution. Now, how did they get there? They were put there in 1996 by Proposition 209. And I co-chaired that campaign, just as I have co-chaired the campaign this year to prevent those words from being removed. And the National Association of Scholars had a lot to do with how Proposition 209 got in the California Constitution. Proposition 209 was the brainchild of two individuals, both of whom were members of the National Association of Scholars. Tom Wood, who is a philosopher, and at the time he was executive director of the California Association of Scholars, that is an affiliate of the NAS, and Glenn Custrid, an anthropologist at Cal State University, Hayward, who was at the time a member of the California Association of Scholars and the NAS. And they put together the proposal, which gained some steam, got the support of a number of people, and eventually wound up being adopted by California voters by a margin, if I'm remembering correctly, it was about 55% to 45%. So it was not close. Prop 209, of course, covers public employment, public education, and public contracting, but we're here to talk about education today, in particular higher education. And I think from what you can tell about who came up with the idea, higher education was the thing that was most on Glenn Custrid and Tom Wood's mind, because they were seeing, as documented by organizations like the Center for Equal Opportunity and the work of Dr. Althea Nagai and the late Dr. Robert Lerner, they were able to document during the 1990s just how large the preferential treatment that was being given by the University of California, and in fact by universities across the country on the basis of race. Essentially in the 1990s, here in California, an African-American student, regardless of family income, regardless of socioeconomic class, with say a B average in high school, would be treated as well as, if not better, than a white or Asian American student with a 4.0 in gaining admission to the University of California. Essentially, universities across the country, but in particular here in California, had been creating what was essentially a racial caste system at our universities. These preferences were causing all sorts of problems. In particular, I would point out that after Prop 209 passed and the University of California was forced to give up racial preferences, Duke University economist Peter Arcidiacono and his co-investigators looked at what effect Proposition 209 had here in California. When students are required to attend universities where their academic credentials put them in the ballpark with other students, guess what? They do much, much better. And as a result, the graduation rates for underrepresented minorities went up. Grade point averages in college for underrepresented minorities went up. The number of underrepresented minorities who would major and continue until graduation with a science and engineering degree, boom, goes up. And we're not talking about small differences. We're talking about significant differences. And so Prop 209 was a big success. And nevertheless, the California legislature was gunning for Prop 209 right from the beginning. And supporters of Prop 209 had to deal with this 3 times. And we managed to beat them back rather easily the first 2 times. It's only this year with Prop 16 that it became a big deal. The first effort to repeal Prop 209 actually occurred when Governor Jerry Brown was in office, and he vetoed the effort, bless him. And you might wonder why, you know, a progressive like Jerry Brown would veto such an effort, but even Governor Brown understood that the method by which the California legislature was trying to repeal Prop 209 was not going to work. It wouldn't get through the courts, and it just didn't make sense. The legislature purported to redefine the terms of Prop 209 to mean the opposite of what California voters had actually intended with Prop 209. When we use the term preferential treatment, you know, we don't really mean preferential treatment, we mean something entirely different. So it got vetoed. It wouldn't have made it through the courts in all likelihood. The second attempt was about 5 years ago. And in this case, something interesting happened in politics. And that was, there was a grassroots Asian American effort to defeat what was then called SCA 5, a Senate effort to amend the Constitution to delete Prop 209. And just like that, they had well over 100,000 signatures on a petition. And these grassroots nations and the people involved with this had very, very little experience in political movements, none that I know of, but they understood correctly that the main victims of an effort to repeal Prop 209 would be their children, Asian American students applying to college. And so they put together protests on very short order. I remember during this period, I was in the thick of teaching classes, and I thought, well, I'm going to help these groups out as soon as I get done with grading my exams. But before that happened, they won. They scared off the legislature, and the SCA 5 did not pass. Fast forward to 2020, the year from hell. And during a period when we were all locked down, the California legislature passed what they called ACA 5. And you know, at first we thought we could defeat it, just as we had the effort a few years before. And you know, it looked good. We had over 100,000 signatures on a petition. We couldn't hold the same protests, but we were holding meetings with members of the California legislature. And then came the death of George Floyd. And suddenly ACA 5 was a freight train coming down grade. Not only did it pass the California Assembly, and we were never sure we could keep it from passing the Assembly, but it also passed the California Senate, which is where we thought we were going to be able to defeat it. Didn't happen. Fortunately, under California law, even the California legislature cannot amend the Constitution in this way without the consent of the people. So passing the legislature simply meant that it became an initiative, or rather a referendum. And at that point, what had been called ACA 5 became Proposition 16. As I said, the good news is when it got to the people, it was defeated. Sure, we couldn't hold the same kind of protests we'd held before, but we could have what we called car rallies, where people got in their car, put signs on their cars, and it worked out pretty well. So in the end, as I said, Proposition 16 was defeated. 56.8% is the count now, and that's very unlikely to move very much. So what happened? First and foremost, I think that the defeat of Proposition 16 was a rejection of the woke agenda, a rejection of identity politics. Prop 16 advocates tried to portray opponents of Prop 16 as white supremacists, which was very odd given that our campaign was actually much disproportionately led by Asian Americans and not by whites at all. Their ads literally showed white men carrying tiki torches and claiming that this is where the support for the opposition came from. But it's important to remember that Prop 16 is not simply the rejection of the summer of 2020's worst identity politics excesses. The truth is that California voters were simply reflecting what polls have shown that Americans have been thinking for decades now. For example, the Gallup Poll. The Gallup Poll has been asking the same question of Americans every few years for the last 20 or some years. And every time, it shows that Americans are against racial preferences in university admissions. And I think they actually present the question pretty fairly. If anything, they tilt it slightly in favor of racial preferences. I'll read you the question here. This is what the Gallup poll has been using many times now. They say, which comes closer to your view about evaluating students for admissions into college or university? That A, applicants should be admitted solely on the basis of merit, even if that results in few minority students being admitted, or B, an applicant's racial or ethnic background should be considered to help promote diversity on college campuses, even if that means admitting some minority students who otherwise would not be admitted. So as you can see, it presents the argument that without racial preferences, schools would be less racially diverse. And as I said, I think it slightly loads the question in favor of preferences because it makes it such an either or solely on what I think will be interpreted to mean academic merit, when some people would be willing to allow a little thumb on the scale in favor of people who are low income, for example, athletes, for example. But at any rate, even with it worded that way, Americans 2 to 1 favor evaluating students based on merit, even if that results in few minority students being admitted. That's what it says. Another way in which that loads it in favor of racial preferential admissions is that it makes it sound like maybe minority students won't get into college anywhere, which of course is not true and has never been true. So 2 to 1. So what did California voters do? They reflected what Americans have been thinking for decades now. In fact, if you look back to the 1980s and 90s, you'll see the same thing. Public opinion experts Paul Snyderman and Thomas Piazza wrote about this back in the 1990s and said that affirmative action, by which they meant race preferential admissions, those admissions policies are controversial precisely because there's really not that much disagreement among Americans, that very, very few Americans do support race preferential admissions. And yet elites do, or what political scientists refer to as elites. As we've shown in with Prop 16 now, the average voter, and that is the average voter from all walks of life, they don't support race preferential admissions. And so what does that mean? What does that mean? Does it mean that Californians don't care about genuinely disadvantaged persons? No, it doesn't. Prop 209, that is current law, the current Constitution, does not prevent the University of California or any other state university income backgrounds or students whose parents didn't get a chance to go to college. And the University of California, in fact, has been doing that now for a number of years, giving a small thumb on the scale in favor of students from low income, students whose parents didn't go to college. Prop 209 has nothing to say about that. And I think that what's important about understanding Prop 209, and I think it caused, some of the people that voted against Prop 16 had this in mind. And that is that what Prop 209 does is simply say you can't judge who is genuinely disadvantaged simply on the basis of race or sex. That is simply not the way that the state of California is put together these days. There are many, many highly successful African Americans and Latinos in the state of California, as there are nationwide. And to say that the children of highly successful, but nevertheless underrepresented minorities should get an extra break, then Senator Barack Obama was asked about that back in, I think, 2007 or so. He was asked, should your daughters, when they are ready for college, back then they were not, but when they are ready for college, should they receive preferential treatment because they're African American? And he said no. He said that makes no sense, and he's right. I think most Californians would agree that the daughter of Ivy League educated parents, at that point a United States senator, later a president, should they receive preferential treatment? Of course not. And I think most Californians see that, and their vote against Prop 16 was for many of them based on that. What is genuinely troubling is how strongly institutions like newspapers here in California. Back in 1996, we actually had some support from newspapers, including newspapers like the UC Berkeley student paper. They actually endorsed Prop 209 back in 1996, and they promptly found that large numbers of their newspaper had been thrown in the trash by opponents of Prop 209 who didn't want people to find out by election day that the students had endorsed 209. We only got one newspaper, that is the Orange County Register, to go against Prop 209, and it's satellites. It has some local newspapers that it owns. We did not do as well with newspapers this time around. We certainly did not do as well with legislators this time around. And corporate America, oh my goodness, we were outspent. The yes side had about $22 million by the end, most of which came from donations of $100,000 or more. We on the other
Gail?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt just a moment. It's 1:50, so politely, if we can just sort of wrap up just so that Rachelle can get her 20 minutes.
Sorry, I didn't have a chance to like create remarks, so I'm sort of making it up as I go along. I can wrap it up right there just by saying we were massively outspent, and yet we won. But still, that's something to think about. Why did that happen? And I have no answers for that right now, so I will just shut up and let you go on to the next speaker.
Well, Rachelle, if you'd be so kind.
Congratulations to Gail and all of those on that wonderful victory in California. That's so exciting to hear and encouraging to the rest of us as well. I'm going to talk about the Chinese government's influence campaign in higher education, specifically by way of Confucius Institutes. And we as a nation have made just overwhelming gains in the last few years in, first of all, recognizing the scope of the problem, doing the investigation to realize that the problem is even bigger than we initially thought, and then just recently starting to do the policy work to push back against that. And the Trump administration deserves a lot of credit for this. And the big question with the election is, would a Biden administration keep that momentum going, or would it let this progress stall? And I think the answer is a bit mixed, but overall, I think a lot of the pieces of this will be unenforced, if not rolled back. But first, let's just take a look at what we've accomplished in the last 4 years. So first of all, on Confucius Institutes, NAS was an early whistleblower on Confucius Institutes, one of the very first to do comprehensive research on this. Our own report only came out in 2017 during the Trump administration. In 2016, there were 109 Confucius Institutes in the country. These are the Chinese government sponsored centers on college campuses, 109 in 2016. Right now, there are at most 67. I say at most because in all likelihood, there are a dozen or more that have also closed, but we're working to verify those closures right now. But still, 109 down to 67. In 2014, under the Obama administration, the Department of Education was actually a co-sponsor with the Hanban, the Chinese government agency that oversees Confucius Institutes, co-sponsoring the National Chinese Language Conference, which is put forward by the College Board and the Hanban jointly. In 2020, the College Board has announced that it is going to sever ties with the Hanban, and the Department of Education, far from co-sponsoring such a conference, is now warning schools about such partnerships with China. We also had the National Defense Authorization Act. This was in August 2018, a law passed by Congress, signed by President Trump, barring the Department of Defense from giving language grants to colleges and universities that also had Confucius Institutes. This was the first national policy passed on Confucius Institutes, and it led to just a slew of colleges and universities closing their Confucius Institutes. Under the Trump administration, we had the FBI probing espionage at Confucius Institutes. This year alone, we had the State Department declare the Confucius Institute U.S. Center as a foreign mission of the PRC. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo went on record saying that he hopes all Confucius Institutes will be closed by the end of the year. This year, again, we had the Department of Education and Department of State issue a joint letter signed by both Pompeo and by Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. Letters going to every school district, every college and university in the country, warning them about Confucius Institutes and Confucius classrooms. We also had the Confucius Act pass the US Senate by unanimous consent. That is now in the House, where Speaker Pelosi is sitting on it and refusing to put it on the calendar. But we also had the Education Department vigorously enforce Section 117. This is our nation's transparency laws on foreign gifts and contracts. So the law says that if a college or university gets $250,000 or more from a foreign source over the course of a calendar year, it has to report that. It has to report that to the Department of Education, and the Department of Education has to publish that on its website so that the public at large can see what foreign donors may be pulling some strings at their colleges and universities. This is a law that had never been enforced, and I mean that quite literally, never had been enforced. NAS blew the whistle on this in 2017. We got the attention of Senator Rob Portman, who had the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations do a whole report on it and Confucius Institutes. They got the attention of the Department of Education. And now for the first time, Secretary DeVos has been vigorously enforcing this. The department has done 12 formal investigations into colleges and universities, Harvard, Yale, Texas A&M, Fordham, Stanford, big name institutions, formal investigations of them for their long history of non-compliance with these federal transparency laws. And the result of that has been $6.5 billion, billion with a B, in back reported foreign gifts that are finally being disclosed as the law requires. So huge gains in foreign gift transparency. And this is not even to mention the various other agency reports that have been done on Confucius Institutes, on China Matters, or the State Department's efforts to stop Chinese military officers undercover enrolling as graduate students in the United States, or the widespread actions by federal grant-making agencies to halt the incursion of China's 1,000 Talents Plan. This is one of 200 talent recruitment plans that the Chinese government operates to lure Western scholars into sharing their research and technology, often illegally, with China. So now the National Institutes of Health, NASA, Department of Energy, all these agencies are investigating 1,000 Talents ties among their grantees. The Justice Department has charged dozens of scholars, including most notably Charles Lieber, the former chair of the chemistry department at Harvard. Lieber, you may recall, his case has been in the news quite a bit. He was secretly receiving $50,000 per month from the Chinese government, a living stipend of $158,000 per year, and $1.5 million to establish a research lab in China. In return, he was supposed to work in China not less than 9 months a year. This is all while still being the chair of the chemistry department at Harvard. 9 months a year in China, working on joint research projects with Chinese researchers, cultivating graduate students, and applying for patents on behalf of a Chinese university. He's been indicted and is awaiting trial. So lots of things that we've discovered just in the last 4 years are going on with the Chinese government's aggressive influence campaign and espionage campaign in higher education. And it took the Trump administration a little while to get going on this. And that is simply because everyone in the country was just realizing the scope of the problem. I mentioned earlier, our report came out in 2017. At that point, we didn't even know about the 1,000 Talents Plan. We didn't know about the depth, even then, of how big Confucius Institutes were and just how influential they were. And it's taken a little while to get a grasp on the problem. Really, in the last year, the policy initiatives have started to come into play, and the administration has been just on the cusp of really getting traction on this. So the big question is, would a Biden administration overturn those gains? Would it keep that momentum going, or would it let this process stall? And I think the answer is a little bit mixed, but overall, I think a lot of the progress that we've made will come to a halt. I think a big way that this will happen is that a lot of these laws and policies will remain on the books, but will be unenforced. They will be unenforced partly because a Biden administration would be less aggressive towards China, I suspect, than the Trump administration has been. But they'll also be unenforced partly because some of these policies, even though they're relatively new, are already becoming outdated, and it will be convenient to leave them outdated and let them become dead letter laws rather than work to keep ahead of the game and keep track with the Chinese government's ever-changing influence campaign. Now, outdated how, you may ask? The Chinese government has been retooling its influence campaign to circumvent the new policies that have gone into place. First of all, with Confucius Institutes, the Chinese government is renaming Confucius Institutes. It's renaming the Hanban, the government agency that has been responsible for overseeing Confucius Institutes. It's reorganizing the whole structure. It's spinning off a new nonprofit that's going to oversee Confucius Institutes. And this may sound like a minor thing. Metaphysically speaking, it is a minor thing. This is not really going to change what Confucius Institutes are. They're still going to remain influence tools of the Chinese government, even if technically it's a nonprofit that is running them. On the whole, there's not going to be much changed, but legally this matters a lot because the definitions that we have in the law for what a Confucius Institute is, those definitions are no longer going to apply. And this is a very big problem that has a pretty easy fix, but you have to update those policies and amend the law. And I'm not sure we're going to have the political will in a Biden administration to do that. Meanwhile, colleges and universities are copying this sleight of hand by the Chinese government. They are renaming their Confucius Institutes, pretty much transferring the bulk of their operations to a new Chinese government-funded center under a different name and seeking to skirt the law. NAS is tracking this reinvention of Confucius Institutes. We have alerted the Education Department and the State Department, and they are looking at this as well. But the big question is, would those departments continue to stay on top of that, keep their policies up to date, and remain ahead of the game on this if we see a Biden administration in the new year? Similarly, I expect that some of the gains on foreign gift transparency will be rolled back or at least unenforced. Again, these are the laws saying that colleges and universities have to report when they get major gifts from foreign sources. The higher education lobby has fought this transparency tooth and nail. Betsy DeVos deserves a lot of credit for fighting back and for actually enforcing the law, going against the higher education lobby on this. But that lobby is pretty strong. It holds some sway over Biden. And I expect that this law, which has been unenforced historically up until now, will be less vigorously enforced. Historically, colleges and universities have basically had it at their discretion whether or not they want to disclose this information. Nobody was checking up on it, and I think we're going to be heading a little bit more towards that direction. NAS has been a watchdog on that, and we're still going to be watching Section 117 compliance and calling out colleges and universities that fail to disclose. But I'm not sure how sympathetic a new Department of Education would be to those concerns. So in light of that, where should NAS and NAS members focus their attention for the next 4 years? I think, first of all, we have to be extra attentive to tracking the evolution of Confucius Institutes. They are being renamed, they are reinventing themselves. We have to be extra vigilant as well with tracking the non-compliance with Section 117 foreign gift and contract reporting, as well as tracking and exposing the 1,000 Talents Plan and whatever new tools the Chinese government is going to come up with and invent. We also need to look to state legislatures. States are starting to look at this a lot more closely. Just this year, we saw the first state legislature look at a bill on Confucius Institutes that was in Alabama. And if we have any Alabama members on this call, there's a really strong bill before your legislature right now, but the Alabama governor, a Republican, is actually opposed to the law, seemingly out of fear that this could damage ties with China and economic trade. So if you're in Alabama and you're in favor of closing down Confucius Institutes, this is a good time to reach out to your state representatives. But other states are looking at this as well. We're working with the Atheni Institute, which is working on model legislation. NAS has been in touch with state legislatures. I think state legislatures are going to be a good place for us to focus over the next 4 years. And finally, I think this is really the time where NAS members and individual concerned citizens can step up and take responsibility and exercise oversight over their own colleges and universities. The Section 117 foreign gift transparency laws. Again, I don't think these are going to be enforced as much as before, but we have had these big gains recently, and there's a new information portal where anyone in the country can go. You can go look up your university. You can download a report showing what gifts they got from which foreign sources, for how much money, whether there were any strings attached to it. This is a tool that is now available more easily to anybody in the country. And so I would encourage NAS members to take a look at that. Look up your university where you work, or the college where your kids are going, or your alma mater. Take a look at that and see what you find. I think it will be interesting to you. I just cannot overemphasize enough the importance of individual people taking responsibility and exercising that oversight. And if that's something that interests you, we would love to work with you on that. So do reach out to us, and I can send you a link directly to that portal, or send you some other tools as well, because I do think we're going to be entering an era where watchdog organizations like NAS and individual responsible citizens are going to be even more crucial than ever. David, I'll turn it back to you.
Sorry, yes, I was just taking a moment to get to unmute and so on. Well, thank you all so very much. I would encourage everybody to send in questions, Q&A or chat. There was one of the questions, by the way, was about video recordings of these sessions. They are being made, they will be up, I think, within 24 hours, a different video recording for, each of the panels, each of the individual speeches. So it should be up real soon now, and that's on our Facebook channel. That's, sorry, on our YouTube channel, I should say. So if you go to YouTube, National Association of Scholars YouTube, you should be able to find that. Now, one question by Howard Cohen. This is for Rachelle, I think. How much gift money is involved in these Confucius Institutes? Millions or hundreds of millions? What exactly do they do? Monitor students from China? Influence departments of Asian studies? Pay for academic studies that are actually just sophisticated PR?
Well, that list is a pretty good start on what they do. They do all of those things. The official purpose of Confucius Institutes is to teach Chinese language and culture, and this is presented as a goodwill offering by the Chinese government, that they're generously helping Americans learn to speak Chinese. But the way this is set up is it's a Chinese government-run program at a college or university. The funding is coming over from China. The teachers are selected by the Chinese government. They have this system set up where technically the Chinese government proposes a slate of candidates, and then the university chooses from among that slate of candidates. So the universities always love to claim that they have final say over who they're hiring, and they control the hiring decisions. But of course, they're choosing from this slate of candidates who are vetted and trained and paid by the Chinese government. But so they do a lot more than teach language. That's kind of their official purpose, their reason for being on campus. But once they get that footprint on campus, they entangle colleges and universities in this financial relationship with the Chinese government. Pretty soon the college president and other administrators find themselves getting wined and dined in China. They may prevent the opening of a Chinese language program, run by the university. The university may choose, may end up just substituting the Confucius Institute. If there is an existing Chinese program, it will work to influence that and to silence criticism of China, or at least to not contradict the Chinese government's line on things like the status of Taiwan or the oppression of Tibet, things like that. And in terms of how much money is involved, it is millions of dollars between all of these universities. And of course, it's not just the funding for the Confucius Institute itself, it's also the trove of money that becomes available to the university once they have this Confucius Institute and establish themselves as a willing partner with the Chinese government.
Thank you. I have another question for Peter Wood, I believe, from Bruce Gilley. Postmodern theorists writing history call the evidence and fact-based arguments of Peter Wood, quote, white man bullshit, unquote. Sorry, maybe I should have bleeped that a bit. Why should we expect 1619 Project to abandon their liberation narrative? Oh, sorry, I think you're still muted.
I'm back fully voiced. I don't expect that those who are promoting the narrative are likely to abandon it for any reason at all other than the discovery that it's failing to penetrate the market that they hope to reach. Nonetheless, I do think that most people are susceptible to the appeals of reason and balance and factual inquiry, and that's where this has to be fought out. If the postmodern ethic that any story is as good as any other story and we're just going to tell the story we want to tell prevails, then all is lost. And I'm declining to embrace that despair. I think that we scholars are dedicated to the pursuit of truth, and there are some methods that get us closer to the truth. Paying attention to what documentary sources say in the original language and their original context goes a long way to explaining what happened in the past, as opposed to sitting around in your armchair and thinking up an interesting fable. Yes, the effort of trying to persuade one's opponents to abandon their fairy tales is probably doomed to defeat, but the efforts to persuade the public is not at all doomed to defeat.
Thank you very much. I would encourage people to send more questions. And meanwhile, I have a question for Gail, which is, so what I gather from my East Coast perspective, that the UC system, in effect, have a substantial amount of, discrimination of one sort via diversity and another, equity, what have you. I guess my question is, how much discrimination is still going on, even under the current legal system, and how much is prevented by the current law? I mean, how much does the law prevent the gross willingness to abuse the law?
It's hard to say. What happened right after 1996 was that when they were prevented from using racial preferences, the numbers changed a lot, and in a good way, in the sense that, yeah, there were fewer underrepresented minority students at Berkeley, but there were more at some of the other University of California schools, and graduation rates went up for those students, GPAs went up. Over time, the University of California has tried to use their preferences based on socioeconomic class they've tried to engineer it in a way to where they get fewer poor whites, fewer poor Asians, and more poor Latinos, more poor African Americans. And so in a sense, they're trying to get back at race. That's very, very difficult to deal with. There's nothing in Prop 209 that prevents a leg up for students based on socioeconomic class. However, that is defined as long as it's not defined in terms of race or national origin or ethnicity. But there are efforts to tweak the definition of socioeconomic class in a way that brings it back to race. Again, that's very hard to track. There are statisticians who believe that they can take the data and figure out exactly what's happening. I have been, some statisticians have told me, or one has, that he would like to try his hand at looking closely at the data and see whether there are Prop 209 violations. But I just want to emphasize that the whole point of public education is to make education available to people regardless of their economic status. And there is no effort to cut back on that. If you took socioeconomic class too strongly and gave preferences that were as big as the race preferences given back in the 1990s, it would result in harm to the students who are the supposed beneficiaries. They would end up having lower graduation rates, lower levels of STEM participation, and lower GPAs. That's not good for anybody, so we don't want that. But a little leg up, perfectly legal, and in fact, I think supported by most people, most Californians, supported by me. I'm in favor of that kind of preference, as long as it doesn't get so high that it ends up hurting somebody's ability to actually do well in college. And so what you're talking about is a real issue. There is some thought that it might be possible to sort these things out and decide what is actually a preference based on race and what's not. But it's difficult, very difficult.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up with another question, I think for Peter, from Mike Goodman on the 1619 project. Does the 1619 project look at the fact that slavery existed in all of the 13 colonies, not merely in the southern ones? Does it look at the fact that only a privileged elite could afford to own even a single slave? Does it consider the fact that emancipation represented probably the biggest redistribution of wealth in history? Close question.
Three questions there. Acknowledgement that slavery existed in all of the colonies. Yes, that's in there. What was the second one?
Does it examine the fact that only a privileged elite could afford to own even a single slave?
I don't recall that it makes that claim, although clearly owning a slave required a certain amount of wherewithal. Were there people of relatively modest means who owned slaves? Yes, there were. Privileged elite would have to be a pretty elastic term to get to every last slave owner in the United States. And the third one was the transfer of wealth on emancipation. No, I don't believe the 1619 project deals with that. I'd have to go back and check Desmond to see if he touches it, but I don't think he does.
All right, thank you. I will again encourage people to send in a few more questions. I guess I will pose a question to Rachelle. And in fact, I mean, is the Chinese government simply set up to be faster at shifting the way they try to exert soft power than we are to come up with defenses?
For sure. The Chinese government has been mastering the art of overseas influence campaigns, and they've been slipping it past our noses for years. So they're way ahead of us in coming up with influence campaigns and different tools. They have the entire United Front work department set up to work on this issue. Massive numbers of people working on this. I cannot overemphasize that really in the last 4 years, we've first of all just even realized that this is happening. And then once we realized it, we've only scratched the surface. By we, I mean the nation. We've only scratched the surface at investigating and finding out the depth of what is involved here. So the amount of work that we've accomplished is huge. The amount of work that is left to do is even bigger and made even more difficult by the fact that the Chinese government is constantly retooling and renaming these campaigns to get past whatever policy barriers we may erect. And the amount of work is going to be even larger and more difficult if the Biden administration does not take this seriously.
Thank you. I guess, I mean, so I am wondering if it is possible to have California, actually, could California have a referendum to prevent the 1619 project curriculum from coming in? That's a sort of a combined question for Gail and Peter.
That's like a question for everybody there. I would say, first of all, that initiatives are extremely difficult to finance. You got to get a lot of signatures before you get something like that on the ballot. And so it would be difficult. But yeah, nothing's impossible. I mean, after all, everybody was predicting that we were going to go down in flames with Prop 16. And by golly, we didn't. We won, and by a lot. Is it possible that tapping into the good sense of California citizens as opposed to its leaders can be a useful thing in the future, not just on the issue that we just had, but on other issues as well? Yeah, that's possible, but be prepared to spend a lot of money.
Ballot initiative is not the way to oppose a curriculum or a curricular module. The way to oppose it is to vote in members of local school boards who are determined to call this to a halt. The state authorities over education can also raise questions about these things if they're willing to, but public pressure can be exerted in lots of ways than simple state initiatives or complex state initiatives. And I would say that this is a made-to-order grassroots issue. The Americans of all sorts have a stake in having an accurate history of their country available to the next generation. If you don't know the American founding, you have no idea why the Bill of Rights says the things that it does. You have no idea why there is a division among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. You have no idea why we have an electoral college. All those things that are based on the idea that humans can't be implicitly trusted for anything, and that we need to be offset against each other, acting on special interests by institutions that are specifically designed in a Madisonian sort of way to ensure that we are, in the end, given the best laws that a democracy can create out of a representative government. All that depends on people actually understanding who we are, where we came from, and replacing actual history with a mythology that says it all comes down to racial oppression and nothing else, is going to be a disaster for representative government in our country. So who should care about that? Well, parents who are sending their children to public schools or to private schools for that matter, who are being taught something that isn't true. Anybody who cares for the future of the country has a vested interest in getting involved with the local school boards and making sure that they push this thing in the right direction. As it stands, both individual teachers and school districts, meaning administrators, are making decisions that this anti-racist campaign in the country has a perfect match in teaching the 1619 project let's go there, and public policy considerations are just brushed aside. And that will continue until an aroused public says no more to that.
Can I add something here? And that is that unfortunately here in California, there is a centralization of the curriculum effort. I got an email just a few days ago from a woman who is fighting the California ethnic studies requirement, which is making a lot of it is critical race theory being taught to students at K through 12. I'm not exactly certain how the new ethnic studies course should work, but this is a top-down sort of thing. This is the state of California demanding ethnic studies classes for students. They also passed a statute this year requiring an ethnic studies course at Cal State University and going beyond what Cal State University itself wanted. So, you know, one of the dangers we're seeing right now is top-down curricular reform in the direction of something like the 1619 project without naming it that. And I haven't had a chance to look at it, but one of my thoughts last night was, I got to call Peter about this. So Peter, I just called you.
Yeah, I know something about it. I'm glad you brought it up. It does raise an issue or takes us back to the presidential election. President Trump has been outspoken in opposition to the 1619 project, at least recently, in the last several months. And part of that is that he recognizes that the federal government does have power here. Enormous amounts of money flow from the Department of Education to the states. If you entail that money with restrictions saying that it cannot be used in any school that teaches the 1619 project, you have influence over those state bureaucracies. Now, I have conservative friends and colleagues who are appalled at the idea that the president or the federal government would involve itself in the substance of American education in the manner of either prohibiting or discouraging a particular curriculum or favoring another one. And I understand their arguments. The US Constitution leaves schools, education in general, to state and local entities. It's not the business of the federal government constitutionally to be doing these things. On the other hand, that Constitution has been swept aside for the last half century by Democratic politicians who have been more than ready to usher into place federal support for activist programs of their own liking. It's not an answer to those activist programs to say, we Republicans are pure as the driven snow and would never do such a thing. And when I hear a conservative say, well, if we do this, it's going to open the door for Democrats to do even more of it, I think the answer to that is a barnyard vulgarity. The Democrats are not waiting on Republicans to make a misstep in order to impose on the country their own programs. They're doing it right and left whenever they want to. So the question is, do Republicans have the gumption to get back in the game and say no to this? Well, part of the answer to that is going to be, of course, determined when this election is settled one way or the other.
I'm going to say thank you all so much. I'm also going to say it's 2:28, a little bit past when we're supposed to be. So I think I'm going to forego even the chance to ask you for last comments. Thank you all so much. It's been a wonderful presentation, and we are going to go in a mere 6 minutes to Bruce Gilley's presentation at 2:35. So